Afterwards, he knew, but he was career in jeopardy. So he just kept hinting, kept leading them. So that's that's a program track. That's terrible.
But that's the way the culture is. If you
Okay, let's get started. Let's get started. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. Before I introduce today's speaker, there is some information that I need to share with you. First of all, this is our last scheduled colloquium of this semester. Next week, we have our annual visit on Wednesday afternoon with the dean, and then the following week is the National A&S meeting, and most of the faculty will be attending that meeting. And the following week, Wednesday after that, is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and that's not a good time. We've learned in the past, the hard way, to have a colloquium. And then the following Wednesday after that is study day. In other words, the semester's open. And so this is the last one that we have scheduled. But hopefully, this may be, we've saved the best for the last. And by that, I mean not only today's speaker, but the technology that we're using today is something that we've never done before. And let's hope it works. In particular, our speaker is not physically with us today. In fact, he's not even on campus. He's not even in Knoxville, Tennessee. He is in his office in Washington, D.C., the Natural Resources Defense Council headquarters in D.C. Let me give you just, since we have an audience full of engineers here, what we're doing is that we're video conferencing with the speaker in D.C. over the Internet, IP, Internet Protocol. We have his slides here on a computer that's hooked to the smart board here. That's primarily for the local audience. We'll take the signal that we get, the video audio signal from the speaker via the video conferencing hookup, and we'll mix that signal with the signal that has the slides on it, which is originating here in this room, and then that mixed signal will be webcast in real time to the internet. So that's what we're doing. I should also add that we've been working on doing this for about 2 months, and we've gotten really good cooperation and help with our colleagues at the NRDC, and it just goes to show you what nuclear engineers and the NRDC can do when they put their mind to do something together that's really good, and we hope it turns out that way. So let me introduce the speaker, who is Dr. Robert Norris. He is a Senior Research Associate with the NRDC, that's the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. Dr. Norris received his Ph.D. in Political Science from NYU in 1976 and has taught at NYU, Miami University in Ohio, Miami's University Extension Program in Europe, in particular Luxembourg, and the American University in Washington, D.C. He has been with the NRDC since 1984. The subject of his presentation today is General Leslie Groves and the Manhattan Project. And the basis for his presentation is a book that he wrote, which has won several literary awards. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Robert S. Norris.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you very much, Lee. Good to be with you this afternoon. The title of my talk today is General Leslie R. Groves and the Manhattan Project, and as Lee mentioned, it is based on my book, which is entitled Racing for the Bomb. Could we have the first slide, please? Here is a photograph of General Groves in 1945, just after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. and the ending of World War II. And what I'd like to do today is to introduce you to General Groves. My argument today and in the book is that he was the indispensable person in building and using the atomic bomb. But where did he come from? And how did he manage to do the task he did in a little over 1,000 days? And I'll conclude with some thoughts on what impact the Manhattan Project has had on the second half of the 20th century. So let's begin and look briefly at General Groves's background. Can we have the next slide, please? Leslie R. Groves, Jr. was born on August 17, 1896, in Albany, New York. He was the third son of a Presbyterian minister who had just joined the Army as a chaplain. For the first 18 years of his life, young Groves would grow up on Army posts and forts all across the country. Here we see a picture on the left. He's the one in the middle. He's the third boy, and a younger sister came later. I conclude from the family dynamics that this made young Groves a very independent young man growing up. His father was often absent, and he had a very strong mother who influenced him a great deal. The family dynamics were very competitive, and he soon distinguished himself as a young man in a hurry. Not surprisingly, growing up on all of these Army posts, he decided that he wanted the Army as a career. And the decision after that, of course, was to try and to get into West Point. In preparation to go to West Point, often in those days, you had college training beforehand. And Groves spent 1 year at the University of Washington in Seattle and 2 years at MIT before he eventually got into West Point. Could we have the next slide, please? Here we see Groves at West Point, and his years of attendance were from 1916 to 1918, the years of World War I. His class was accelerated for the need for Army officers, and he actually graduated on November 1st, 1918, just 10 days before the armistice, of course, and there was no opportunity for him to go to Europe and be in World War I. He graduated number 4 in his class, and I argue that West Point clearly had a deep impact on shaping Groves. At the time, if you graduated near the top of your class, you had your choice of which branch to choose, and not surprisingly, young Groves chose the Corps of Engineers. May we have the next slide, please? The Army Corps of Engineers, I contend and argue in the book, is really, I think, the secret to understanding Groves and much of what happened during the Manhattan Project. The Army Corps of Engineers is a rather extraordinary institution. It dates, of course, before the Revolutionary War, and West Point itself was founded by President Jefferson as an engineering school, the first in the country. Congress passed laws in the early 19th century to have Army engineers conduct major civilian projects, surveying, mapping, exploring, water projects, harbors, canals, and dams. And over the course of the 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries of its existence, it has had a deep impact on the geography and topography of the United States. Groves spent the period between the wars, from 1919 to 1918, performing various Army Corps of Engineer projects. We also should recall that the Army of the day was very, very tiny, 17th in the world, about 135,000 strong, and just by way of comparison, during World War II, that Army would grow 60 times up to 8 million. So this is a minuscule Army with a very tiny officer class, and the Army Corps of Engineers was a tiny part of that, maybe 5%. But by the same token, this tiny officer corps produced an extraordinary array of generals which led the United States in World War II. Eisenhower, Patton, MacArthur, Bradley, and so on. Groves had many interesting assignments during this 20-year period with engineering projects. each one of them getting larger and assuming more and more responsibility. Then we have the next slide, please. One of them had to do with investigating whether or not a second canal should be built through Nicaragua. This was after the Panama Canal, of course. And here we see Groves with his wife and now a son and a daughter in the 1930s. He was an officer on the fast track, getting greater and greater responsibilities. Upon coming home from Nicaragua, he served in Washington in the Chief's office, went to Fort Leavenworth, the Command and General Staff School, and then on to the Army War College. All of the places you would expect a rising officer to go to. And in 1939, he was in the right place at the right time. After graduating from the War College, he was assigned to the General Staff, just as the United States is beginning to mobilize for World War II. As war broke out on September 1st, 1939, some, including Roosevelt himself, saw that the United States was eventually going to be involved and that steps had to be taken to prepare for it. Though public opinion was opposed and wanted to stay out, the strong isolationism of the time, throughout 1940 and 41, we have measures like the draft and the beginnings of building projects. And Groves became the key person in constructing all of the camps, ammunition plants, depots, airfields, and factories that became the backbone of what's come to be known as the arsenal of democracy. Engineers were in charge, and Groves was in the right place at the right time. May we have the next slide, please? One of those building projects was the Pentagon. Here we see General Brian Somerville on the left, a very commanding, formidable person in his own right, basically Groves' boss. And it was under his inspiration that he decided to consolidate all of the many offices spread far and wide throughout the Washington area under one roof. And this was in the summer of 1941. He quickly put together a team of architects and assigned responsibility for building the building to General Groves, to, at that point, Lieutenant Colonel Groves, who can be seen over on Somerville's left in the right-hand picture. Ground was broken, coincidentally enough, on September 11th, 1941. And the first occupants of the building moved in 6 months later in April 1942. The whole building was completed in 16 months, 6 million square foot building, 15,000 workers working 24 hours a day to get it done under Groves' direction. May we have the next slide, please? All the while mobilization is going on, tremendous discoveries were being made in the field of physics. Of course, in January 1939, the revolutionary news of the discovery of fission is made public, and word of it is conveyed to Franklin Roosevelt via the famous letter by Albert Einstein. The project still in 1940 and 41 was relatively small scale, mainly done at universities, and some British scientists were also involved in their own country. The British were more optimistic about the prospects, and eventually Roosevelt's science advisor, the man seen in the middle, a man named Vannevar Bush, became convinced that the reality of military purpose to atomic energy was possible, and he and his companion here, his colleague James Conant, who was the president of Harvard University, basically got the project going in a major way. Just after Pearl Harbor, it is decided by Bush and others here to put the Army in charge. This is going to be a big project. No longer can it be conducted at the university level with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, which were the budgets then, but it's going to grow into millions and maybe even hundreds of millions. And Bush saw that the best place to put this was in the Army Corps of Engineers. And so on September 17th, 1942, Leslie Richard Groves, then a colonel, is informed that he is to head what will become known as the Manhattan Project. May we have the next slide, please? Here we see Groves' immediate superiors. On the left, of course, George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, and on the right, Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. One is, I think, amazed at the degree of independence that Groves had in conducting this, only intermittently conferring with his superiors only when he needed them. So the management style is very interesting to look at in looking at the Manhattan Project and how Groves ran it. It would be hard to duplicate today, I think. If we could go to the next slide, please. The key problem facing the project was how to produce enough fissile material and design a bomb and have it ready for use during this war, during World War II. Groves decided to pursue multiple methods all at once to try and make two different kinds of material. One, of course, was highly enriched uranium, and the other was the just discovered plutonium. Here we see two of the giant factories, not far from Knoxville, of course, at Oak Ridge. On the left, the famous K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, and on the right, part of the Y-12 electromagnetic isotope separation plant. So here the challenge was to separate the isotope U-235 from the more abundant U-238, a technical feat that seemed staggering at the time and needed these massive factories to get it done. In the next slide, we see the facility where the plutonium was produced, and that is at Hanford, Washington, a site that Groves chose and set about DuPont to build a reactor fueled with uranium, of course, that would produce enough plutonium for a bomb. It was Groves' responsibility to recruit the major firms that both built and operated these plants. He knew of many of these companies from what he had done prior to the war. He had just been building munition plants with DuPont, for example. He knew the engineers. He knew the corporate officials. And once he got his new job, he drew upon all of this experience to put them into the Manhattan Project. The reactors here would eventually produce the 6 kilograms that were needed for the first test bomb that took place in July 1945, and another 6 kilograms that was used in the bomb in Nagasaki on August 9th. In the next slide, we see the third major site of the Manhattan Project, of course, and that is the Los Alamos site in New Mexico, a place where the bomb was going to be designed and staffed with world-class scientists. And perhaps there has never been a group like this before or since. In the next slide, we see just a handful of the Nobel Prize winners. 8 had already won a Nobel Prize at the time, and more than a dozen other scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project would do so after the war. In the next slide, let's just step back one moment to 1939, at the very outbreak of World War II, when the discovery of a fission had occurred. And the great fear at the time was that Hitler might use his scientists to make an atomic bomb. And already many German and other European scientists had fled to the United States. Some stayed, the most famous being the man in the middle here, Werner Heisenberg. Groves, in charge of the Manhattan Project, was absolutely obsessed with trying to find out if the Germans were working on a bomb. There are a lot of good incidents to relate here. One sort of James Bond-like story has to do with the fellow on the left, a famous baseball player named Moe Berg, who became a spy during the war and was involved in what became known as the Alsos mission, which was an effort to find out what the Germans were doing and afterwards rounded up the German scientists after the war was over. Not enough time to go into all of this interesting detail, but we should remember that one of the chief inspirations of the time, of course, was the fear of the German bomb and the need to get one before Hitler did. In the next slide, we see that the other famous person, probably the most other famous person in the Manhattan Project, of course, is J. Robert Oppenheimer. This was Groves' choice as well, and an inspired one it was. Against the advice of almost everyone, his security officials and other scientists even, they recommended that Oppenheimer not be chosen to head the scientific laboratory at Los Alamos. We could spend several lectures on Oppenheimer. I know of 4 biographies in the works right now on him, and he is a very fascinating character and had a very, very good relationship with General Groves. In the next slide, we see the preparations for the test detonation that eventually took place on July 16, 1945. In an astonishingly short period of time, a little over 1,000 days, enough material was fabricated at both Oak Ridge and at Hanford for the 2 types of bombs that were being prepared. You will recall that one type was based on what's called a gun assembly design, where one piece of subcritical, highly enriched uranium is fired into another down a gun barrel. This became the bomb known as Little Boy that would be dropped at Hiroshima. The second bomb design was more complex, involving plutonium. You can't use the gun design with plutonium, and they had to develop a different way of assembling the fissile material, and that came to be known as implosion, where you're forcing a subcritical piece of plutonium to criticality and causing a detonation. And here on the left, we see what was called the gadget, the experimental device that was raised to a top of a 100-foot tower in the middle of the test site at Trinity near Alamogordo. And on the right, the beginning of the nuclear age at dawn on July 16th. In the next slide, in addition to all the other things that Groves was doing, he had to prepare for a means to deliver the bombs. Groves had the Army Air Forces modify a group of B-29 bombers, the bomber of the day that was just really coming off of the assembly lines, and to train special crews and set up special bases both in the United States and in the Pacific. This came to be known as the 509th Composite Group, and the head of the composite group was Colonel Paul Tibbets, seen in the center. On the left will be you can see the crew of the Enola Gay, the B-29 that carried the Little Boy bomb, and on the right the crew of Boxcar, which will be the bomber that carries the bomb for the mission over Nagasaki. In the next slide we see mock-ups of the Little Boy bomb, longer and thinner, the gun assembly type, and on the right, the fatter, more rounded implosion plutonium bomb known as Fat Man. The next slide, please. Those bombers carried out their missions on August 6th and August 9th, one over Hiroshima and one over Nagasaki, the only two times that nuclear weapons have been used. And here we see the destruction that they caused. Groves himself, in the next slide, retired soon after the war was over in early 1948. Still a young man, but basically no room for him in the post-war Army. Another story we don't have time to go into. But Groves assumed a position with Remington Rand in Connecticut and became a semi-public figure, speaking a great deal, and eventually writing a book called Now It Can Be Told in 1962. The next slide, please. Groves finally died in July 1970, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery, about 3 miles away from where I am right now. And in the final slide, we'll just use this to sum up some of the things that I think we can conclude about the importance and the impact of the Manhattan Project. Of course, building nuclear weapons and using them set off an arms race with the Soviet Union and eventually other nations, Britain, France, China, and today even India and Pakistan, and maybe others. And the bomb became sort of the centerpiece of the Cold War. So all of this begins with the Manhattan Project and is part of its legacy. The Manhattan Project can also be pointed to, I think, as a forerunner of what became known as the national security state. The characteristics of it are great attention to security and secrecy, black budgets hidden from the public, compartmentalization, and a great deal of reliance upon intelligence and counterintelligence. All of these things were really non-existent prior to World War II. They became concrete during the war in a major way during the Manhattan Project, and became features of post-war America and continue to this very day. Another legacy of the Manhattan Project, I think, is to see it as a forerunner of what became known as the military-industrial complex. This is the interlocking relationship between government and industry and science and the military that is also so much a feature of the Cold War. So on that note, we still have some time for some questions, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, we now have time for questions and comments from the local audience, and also if we get any from the cyber audience. Do we have any questions or comments? Peter?
Do I have to use the microphone, or is this good enough?
Can you hear? Speak up. Speak louder.
Okay. During the course of your research into the Manhattan Project, what opinion did you form of Heisenberg? He's sort of a controversial figure. He claimed after the war that he really boycotted the German effort. Other people didn't believe that. That's a controversial visit with Niels Bohr and friends. They were friends before this visit, and after the visit, I guess they became almost enemies. I'm curious what your opinion is.
Yes, well, you point to an issue that sort of refuses to die and produces endless controversy and curiosity. My own opinion is that Heisenberg did not know how to make an atomic bomb. There are other people who believe that he did know how and purposely sabotaged the effort within the German hierarchy, army, and so on, and told them that it would be impossible. If you look at the chronology of when these things occur, of course, the German bomb program does begin to get going about 1939, 1940, 1941, and it is finally decided in the spring of 1942 not to go forward with a full-speed effort. This is just at the time the United States is just deciding to go ahead with a crash program. Now, the Germans decided, people like Albert Speer and others, that it was not going to make a difference during the war. It looked as though the Germans already had the war won, and there would not be time for this bomb to be instrumental. So that was another factor leaning against them not going forward. It's an endlessly fascinating topic. I think most of the evidence goes to show that the Germans just didn't put enough effort into thinking through all of the problems and realizing that you could actually make a bomb with a relatively small amount of HEU. I mean, Heisenberg thought that the effort to make it would be almost impossible, and that you needed so much of it that it would be almost impossible. Of course, he and his colleagues were captured by the Americans in April and May of 1945 and put into a country estate in England for a 6-month period from July to December 45. General Groves, typical of him, had the place bugged and listened every 2 weeks to a transcript of what the Germans were talking about. And on August 6th, heard the great surprise by Heisenberg and others that the Americans had made an atomic bomb. Soon after, Heisenberg realized his mistake, did the recalculations in his mind, and said, of course, it can be done. But in the end, I think his effort to make himself look good in the eyes of history is not, the evidence doesn't bear it out.
Okay, do we have other questions from the local audience? Dr. Peavy?
I was interested in your comment about how well Dr. Oppenheimer and General Groves got along. Since, as you pointed out, the military, that alliance is sort of a new thing, then it's sort of surprising based on, the general stereotypic personality types. Was it just the war effort? I mean, the fact that everybody's come together for this common effort that explained that?
Well, you've raised a very, very interesting relationship between sort of two different cultures that had to be combined here to have this effort succeed. Groves was a very, very pragmatic person, and I think one part of his genius it was able to size people up and know who could get the job done for him, whatever it was. And he did this time after time after time. I think this is an attribute of leadership. It's what we want our leaders to be able to do. And certainly it's a quality in the military that is highly prized, and Groves had it to a great degree. And almost immediately upon meeting Oppenheimer in October 1942, he saw things in Oppenheimer that other people didn't, and decided that he was going to be the person to do the job. Oppenheimer, of course, had a background that was, his wife was a communist, his brother was a communist, his sister-in-law was a communist. He flirted with communist causes, and according to a recent book by a colleague of mine named Greg Herkin, who just wrote a book called Brotherhood of the Bomb, he says that Oppenheimer himself was a member of the Communist Party, a sort of secret professional cell. And Groves knew almost all of this and waved it all aside and saw that Oppenheimer's driving ambition was going to put all of this behind him, and he would work as hard as he could to produce this bomb in as quick a time as possible. I say in the book that the bomb became, for both of them, their route to immortality. So we had two incredibly ambitious people who saw in each other how to get what they both wanted. On Groves' side, a charismatic figure who was a genius, obviously, and was able, when put to the test in building the Los Alamos Library, to lead it in a short period of time to produce the two types of bombs. So that's what Groves saw in Oppenheimer. For Oppenheimer, on Groves' side, Oppenheimer saw that Groves could give him anything he wanted. Anything. Any scientist in America was his. Any resource was his. All he had to do was ask for it, and Groves would get it for him. So this was a marriage made in heaven here with the two of them. They had an excellent relationship during the war. It continued after the war, even through the difficult time of the Oppenheimer security trial. I call it a trial. It wasn't really a trial, a hearing. In the spring of '54, Groves did testify and was put in an awkward position in answering questions from this kangaroo court. He was asked if he would choose Oppenheimer again, and Groves said absolutely. He was the perfect person for the job. And then he was asked, would you choose him today? 1954. And Groves, of course, had to answer, not under the current security rules, I could not. So, nevertheless, they remained close until Oppenheimer's death in 1967. And it's one of the best stories, I think, of the Manhattan Project, these two dramatic personalities. But thank you for the question.
Okay, do we have other questions and comments from anybody? Okay, Dr. Hines?
On your last slide where you talk about the importance and the impact of the Manhattan Project, a lot of people, and maybe some of the politically correct people, would see most of those items as being negatives. Can you comment on some of the positives?
On the military-industrial complex, on the military-industrial complex side of things, I mean, we have interlocking set of enormous institutions which have produced great plenty in terms of prosperity for our country. I think all of these things probably have two faces to them, and there are positive and negative things about them. Science has made enormous contributions with its attachment to the government, the space program, rocketry, and satellites, and I mean, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing today without the contributions of science and government in producing the Internet. The Internet was a DARPA project, and on and on. On the other side of things, on the national security state, there I think the record might be a little darker in terms of what has happened in terms of democracy, widespread accountability, openness, and I mean, we're having discussions today, are we not, about the degree of secrecy and the reach of power of the Justice Department and the Pentagon and others, about how much to make public about A, B, and C. So this, I think, is a darker part, but that would be a brief answer.
I kind of see, without the Manhattan Project, where we attained criticality, we would have never gone on and had nuclear power, medical isotopes, and a lot of these other good things. But I think, that we should remember that we wouldn't have those either. That's true.
Point well taken.
Okay. Any other questions and comments? Fred? Dr. Mine?
Well, this question's a little bit different. Now that we're in what appears to be a worldwide war with Islamic extremists, some people have looked back at the Cold War and said, oh, that was really World War III. It was just fought differently. And the end came about differently than the types of war we had in World War I and World War II. Have you thought anything about that, and do you see any use of that as helping expand our conception of what war is and how we prepare for it and deal with it?
Well, you tossed me a tough one there. Well, I think the two big wars of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, were sort of traditional although the scale was enormous. I think we have to ask whether or not the atomic bomb had something to do with preventing a Third World War of the type the others were, sort of mass armies and all of that. And I do think that it probably had a role in preventing that. Now, in preventing the massive kind of war, it led to these proxy kind of wars and the Cold War technique through other countries and guerrillas and this, that, and the other thing. So the nature of war was transformed, and our present plight is difficult to determine because it is markedly different from even that. There was just a speech given by Brzezinski the other day questioning whether or not the use of the phrase war on terror is helpful to understanding what's going on. And he was critical of it and thought that it only brought about conceptual confusion. It's not really a war, it's something else. It doesn't get at the roots of the issue. And thus we should think a little harder about what it is that we are really facing. And perhaps if we do that, we'd have a better chance of diminishing that serious threat. And I think that's a point well taken. On Sunday, John Keegan was on Book TV here, the great military historian. He was asked some of these questions, and probably should defer to him as he's the master of understanding war. But I think it's a good question, and that was about my best answer I can give off the cuff.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? I don't, local audience. Peter?
What the heck? On a lighter note, apocryphal stories, Oak Ridge has a lot of tennis courts, and the apocryphal story is that the origin of some of these tennis courts is Leslie Grove, who was an avid tennis player. Can you confirm this?
I can't absolutely confirm it, but I strongly suspect it. Groves was an avid tennis player from when he was a teenager, incredibly competitive. Now you saw pictures of him there. He's not a thin man here. He was always either about to go on a diet, or coming off of a diet, and his weight ballooned from around the 200-pound up to 240, 245. He had a ferocious sweet tooth. The other stories, of course, are that he kept some of these candies in his safe in the office here, and he's the most disciplined man I've ever come across in person or in reading about. But the only thing he couldn't really discipline was his willpower over his weight. He just had a bad metabolism, which I think has contributed, unfortunately, over the years to diminishing his image and his place. What I tried to do in this book was give him a fair shake and really look at him straight on and see that he is the central person in the bomb project. But even with being a little overweight most of the time, he never lost his love of tennis, would play all the time. And at the tennis courts at Oak Ridge, I am pretty sure that he, in his visits there, I gave a talk at Oak Ridge last May, and I tried to total up the amount of time that he spent at Oak Ridge and how many trips he came to Knoxville, took the road to Oak Ridge, sometimes would come for a day and leave in the afternoon, believe it or not, or sometimes he'd stay overnight at the Hotel Alexander there. The courts are right in front. So I'm sure he managed to get a game or two in from time to time. And just one quick story. After his retirement and his knees got a little bad, he took up golf. And there's one quick story here. He goes out to the Army-Navy Club in Arlington here with, he's a general now, he's a two-star general, he's still in Washington, and he has a young captain come to play golf with him. And they're out on the course, and Groves lines it up, and he duffs one over into the rough. And as he was doing, just as he was doing that, a plane was coming into National Airport and cast a shadow. And so General Groves turns to Captain, the captain says, I hope you're going to give me this one over again, aren't you? And the young the captain told me this story in person, said to the general, says, no, General, I'm sorry, you're going to have to play it as it lies. And that was a kind of an example of, and Groves, I think, respected that. If this captain had not come up with this answer, I think he probably would have been sent off to Alaska. The young captain did the right thing, told the general to play by the rules, and that was that. So, just a quick story of showing some of his character, I think.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I think, if you recall, at the beginning of today's colloquium, I made the statement that I believe that we've saved the best for the last, and I hope you agree with me that we did and do that. Let me remind everyone that we do have refreshments downstairs. Unfortunately, our speaker today cannot join us for refreshments like he normally does, but before we adjourn, let's express our appreciation to Dr. Norris for his presence. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Lee. That worked perfectly.
Combining is the one on the interstate. That.
Yeah, it'll be
That must have been the tough part.
what you saw there was